Melanie King had always prided herself on her ability to stay composed, no matter the challenge. As a data analyst in a high-pressure corporate environment, she was used to solving complex problems under tight deadlines. But after the death of her husband 2 years ago, she realized that life wasn't just about logic and perseverance. It was about finding peace for herself and her 2 children, Lily and Jack. Moving to the suburbs was supposed to be that fresh start. A quiet life in a beautiful home with a backyard pool that her late husband had always dreamed of having for their family. For Melanie, it wasn't just a luxury. It was a promise to herself that she could create a safe, happy place for her children to grow up. Their new home was everything she had envisioned, a classic 2-story house with white shutters, surrounded by a tall wooden fence that ensured privacy from the world outside. The highlight was, of course, the pool. A sparkling blue rectangle framed by a meticulously tiled deck. For her 10-year-old daughter Lily and 8-year-old son Jack, the pool was a dream come true. On their very first day, the children had jumped in as soon as the movers left, laughing and splashing in the cool water under the afternoon sun. Melanie sat nearby, sipping iced tea and smiling as she watched them play. This was what her husband would have wanted, his family thriving, even without him. For a moment, everything felt right. That illusion didn't last long. As the sun began to set, the sound of the gate latch clicking open drew Melanie's attention. Turning her head, she saw a tall, wiry man in his late 50s standing at the edge of her backyard. He was impeccably dressed in a light gray suit, his thinning silver hair combed back neatly. His face wore the kind of smug smile that immediately made Melanie's guard go up. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped onto her property with an air of authority, his polished shoes clicking against the tile deck. "Evening," the man said, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. "I'm Silas Whitaker, the HOA president. I wanted to come by and personally welcome you to the neighborhood." Melanie forced a polite smile, standing to greet him. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. I'm Melanie King. These are my children, Lily and Jack." Silas barely glanced at the kids, his gaze fixated on the pool instead. "Ah, yes. Beautiful property you've got here. And this pool, stunning. Did the previous owner leave it in this condition, or did you have it renovated?" "It was part of the house when we bought it," Melanie replied cautiously, not liking the way he studied the pool as though it were a problem to be solved. "Well, I hope you're aware of the rules," Silas said, his tone sharpening. "Pools are a significant liability in our community. We have strict regulations in place to ensure safety and compliance. I trust you've reviewed the HOA guidelines?" "I skimmed through them," Melanie admitted, trying to keep her tone neutral. "But the pool is on private property, so I assumed." Silas cut her off with a practiced wave of his hand. "Private property or not, the HOA has jurisdiction over anything that might impact the community. For example, I couldn't help but notice that your children were in the pool unsupervised. That's a violation of Section 7.3 of the HOA regulations. All children under the age of 16 must be accompanied by an HOA-certified safety monitor." Melanie blinked, her polite smile faltering. "Excuse me? This is my pool. I was sitting right here watching them. I understand your concerns," Silas said, though his tone suggested the exact opposite. "But rules are rules. If an accident were to happen, the HOA could be held liable, and that's not a risk we're willing to take. For your safety and the safety of others, I'm going to have to insist that the pool remain off-limits until you hire an approved monitor or attend one of our safety certification courses." Melanie stared at him, disbelief and anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm perfectly capable of supervising my own children, thank you." Silas's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you think so, Ms. King, but the rules exist for a reason. I'd hate to see you incur any penalties for noncompliance. Consider this a friendly warning." With that, he turned on his heel and strolled out of the yard, leaving Melanie standing there, stunned. She looked over at her children, who had climbed out of the pool and were now wrapped in towels, their expressions confused and a little frightened. What should have been a perfect day had been marred by a man whose arrogance and authority seemed limitless. That night, Melanie dug out the HOA's welcome packet and pored over every page of the regulations. Section 7.3 was exactly as Silas had described, but the language was vague enough to leave room for interpretation. Still, it was clear that the HOA viewed the pool as a liability, and Silas was determined to enforce their rules to the letter. Melanie felt a knot of defiance tighten in her chest. This was her home, her sanctuary, and she wasn't about to let some self-important HOA president dictate how she raised her children. The next morning, she sent Lily and Jack to school and spent the day calling her real estate agent and a few neighbors to get a clearer picture of what she was dealing with. What she learned was both illuminating and infuriating. Silas Whitaker had been HOA president for over a decade, and during that time, he had cultivated a reputation for being a control freak. He was known for issuing fines for the smallest infractions, from slightly overgrown grass to mailboxes painted in the wrong shade of beige. More troubling, however, were the stories about how he had targeted specific homeowners, pressuring them to sell or forcing them to comply with increasingly unreasonable demands. Melanie realized this wasn't just about the pool. Silas was testing her, seeing how far he could push before she pushed back. But Melanie wasn't the type to back down from a fight. This was her home, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. Not Silas, not the HOA, and certainly not anyone who thought they could intimidate her into submission. What Melanie didn't know was that Silas Whitaker never played fair. And this was just the beginning. The more Melanie thought about it, the angrier she became. Silas had deliberately misrepresented the rules, banking on her ignorance to push his agenda. But why? What did he stand to gain by targeting her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the mail. She walked out to the mailbox, expecting the usual assortment of bills and advertisements. But among the stack was a letter with the Homeowners Association's logo emblazoned on the envelope. She tore it open and scanned the contents, her irritation quickly turning into rage. The letter was an official warning stating that her pool was now classified as a potential safety hazard and would require immediate inspection by an HOA-approved contractor. It went on to say that until the inspection was completed, the pool was to remain unused. If she failed to comply, she would face daily fines of $100. The letter was signed, of course, by Silas Whitaker. Melanie stormed back into the house, clutching the letter in one hand as she grabbed her phone with the other. She dialed the number listed at the bottom of the letter, her heart pounding with frustration. After several rings, a cheerful but robotic voice answered. Homeowners Association office, this is Linda speaking. How can I help you today? This is Melanie King. I received a letter this morning about my pool being classified as a safety hazard. I'd like to speak to whoever is responsible for this. Yes, Ms. King, Linda replied, her tone not quite managing to mask the condescension. I see your file here. That would be Mr. Whitaker. Unfortunately, he's in meetings all day, but I'd be happy to assist you. I don't think you can. Melanie snapped. This letter is absurd. My pool is on private property, and it's not a hazard to anyone. I'd like to know on what basis this classification was made. Well, Linda said, her voice growing slightly sharper. As per our guidelines, any pool that is deemed to pose a potential risk to the community can be subject to review. Mr. Whitaker himself inspected your property yesterday and made the determination. Melanie felt her blood boil. Inspected? He didn't inspect anything. He barged into my yard uninvited and made up a bunch of nonsense about rules that don't even apply to my property. This is harassment. I'm sorry you feel that way, Ms. King, Linda said, her tone icy now. But Mr. Whitaker's decisions are final. If you'd like to dispute the classification, you'll need to submit an appeal in writing. Otherwise, the inspection must take place within 7 days, or fines will begin to accrue. Melanie clenched her jaw, forcing herself to take a deep breath. Fine, she said curtly. I'll submit an appeal. But let me be clear, I'm not going to let this go. Have a nice day, Linda replied with false cheerfulness before hanging up. Melanie spent the rest of the day drafting her appeal, carefully citing the HOA handbook and pointing out the flaws in Silas's claims. She dropped the letter off at the HOA office that afternoon, feeling a small sense of satisfaction as she handed it to Linda, who accepted it with a forced smile. But her victory was short-lived. When she returned home, she found that someone had left a bright yellow sign on her front gate. It read, "Warning, unsafe conditions, do not use pool." The sign bore the HOA's logo, along with a bold red stamp that said, "Mandatory review pending." Melanie ripped the sign off the gate, crumpling it in her hands as she stormed into the house. She was seething with frustration, but she refused to let Silas win. She called a local contractor and scheduled a private inspection of the pool, determined to prove that it was perfectly safe. Over the next few days, she kept a close eye on her property, wary of further interference from the HOA. The contractor arrived on time and conducted a thorough inspection, confirming what Melanie already knew: the pool was in excellent condition and posed no safety risks. Armed with the report, she sent a copy to the HOA along with a strongly worded letter demanding that they remove the classification immediately. But Silas wasn't done. A few days later, Melanie awoke to find her pool filled with a layer of muddy water. At first, she thought it was a freak accident. Maybe a storm had blown debris into the pool overnight. But as she approached the water's edge, she noticed something odd. The mud wasn't just on the surface. It was thick and clumpy, as though someone had deliberately dumped dirt into the pool. Her heart sank as she spotted tire tracks leading away from her backyard gate. Someone had done this on purpose. Melanie immediately checked the footage from her newly installed security cameras, hoping to catch the culprits in the act. To her dismay, the cameras had been tampered with. The video feed was nothing but static for the hours between midnight and dawn. Whoever had sabotaged her pool had come prepared. She called the police to report the incident, but the officer who arrived seemed indifferent. "It's probably just some neighborhood kids messing around," he said with a shrug. "Nothing we can really do without evidence." "It's not kids," Melanie insisted. "This is targeted harassment. I know the HOA is behind this." The officer gave her a skeptical look. "Do you have proof of that?" Melanie hesitated. Without the camera footage, she had nothing concrete to tie the incident to Silas or the HOA. Frustrated, she thanked the officer and sent him on his way. But as she stood by the ruined pool, staring at the muddy water, she felt a new resolve take hold. This wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about standing up to people who thought they could bully her into submission. If Silas wanted a fight, he was about to get one. Appeals, sending reports, and attempting to reason with people who clearly weren't interested in logic or fairness. But this was no longer about regulations. It was personal. The pool was the heart of her new home, a symbol of everything she had worked for and everything she wanted to protect for her children. And someone, likely Silas Whitaker, had gone out of their way to defile it. Melanie didn't have time to wallow in frustration. She needed action. By mid-morning, she had hired a pool cleaning service, a small local company run by a man named Frank, who showed up with his crew just hours after her call. As Frank inspected the damage, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Whoever did this wasn't messing around," he said, gesturing to the sludge-filled water. "This isn't just dirt. They dumped a mix of clay, debris, and what looks like cement powder. That stuff will clog your filters and ruin the pool lining if we don't act fast." "Can you fix it?" Melanie asked, already bracing for the worst. "It'll take a few days and cost more than usual," Frank admitted. "But yeah, we can get it cleaned up." "Do it," Melanie said firmly. She refused to let this setback intimidate her. As the crew got to work, Melanie stepped inside to make a few more calls. First, she contacted her lawyer, Carol Hastings, to report the vandalism and discuss her next move. Carol, a no-nonsense attorney with years of experience dealing with HOA disputes, listened patiently as Melanie explained what had happened. "This isn't just harassment," Carol said after a long pause. "It's destruction of property. If we can prove it was the HOA or someone acting on their behalf, we could have grounds for a lawsuit." Do you have any evidence? The security cameras were tampered with. Melanie admitted, the frustration clear in her voice. But there were tire tracks near the gate. Maybe we can match them to a vehicle. It's a start, Carol said. I'll send someone to document the scene. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. Letters, emails, even phone calls with the HOA. The more we have, the stronger our case will be. Melanie hung up and immediately began combing through the HOA's regulations and recent communications. She noticed a pattern. Every time Silas had contacted her, it had been to impose arbitrary restrictions, levy fines, or escalate the situation further. It wasn't just about safety or rules. It was about control. Silas wanted her to feel helpless, to force her into compliance through sheer exhaustion. By the evening, Frank's crew had made significant progress draining the pool and removing most of the sludge. But as Melanie walked out to thank them, she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. A bright yellow flyer had been taped to her front door. She ripped it off and read the bold, capitalized text at the top. Notice of non-compliance. Failure to schedule HOA inspection. The flyer detailed a new set of penalties, including daily fines and the potential for legal action if she didn't allow an HOA-approved contractor to assess the pool. The date for compliance had been set for the following morning, just 12 hours away. Melanie's first instinct was to tear the flyer to shreds, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly what Silas wanted, to push her to the brink and make her react emotionally. Instead, she pulled out her phone and took a picture of the notice, sending it to Carol with a brief message. New tactic. Need advice. ***. Carol called back almost immediately. This is ridiculous. They can't impose a new deadline with less than 24 hours notice. It's a clear overreach. They're escalating, Melanie said, pacing the length of her kitchen. First the mud, now this. It feels like they're trying to overwhelm me. That's exactly what they're doing. Carol agreed. But they're also making mistakes. Every unreasonable demand, every unexplained action, it all builds your case. Let them dig their own hole. Just document everything. Melanie decided to take Carol's advice, but her patience was wearing thin. She was tired of feeling like a target, tired of wondering what the HOA would throw at her next. That night, she stayed up late reviewing the security footage from before the cameras had been tampered with. There was nothing incriminating, but she noticed something odd. A black SUV had driven past her house multiple times the night before the vandalism. The vehicle never stopped, but its behavior was suspicious enough to make her take note. The next morning, as the HOA contractor arrived at her gate, Melanie was waiting with her phone in hand, ready to record everything. The contractor, a middle-aged man with a clipboard and a bad attitude, barely acknowledged her as he walked into the backyard. He spent less than 5 minutes inspecting the pool, most of which had already been cleaned, and declared it in violation of HOA standards. When Melanie pressed him for specifics, he simply shrugged and muttered something about structural risks. This is ridiculous, Melanie said, filming him as he hastily filled out his report. You didn't even check the pool equipment. How can you call this a proper inspection? I'm just doing my job, the man replied, avoiding eye contact. If you have an issue, take it up with the HOA. He handed her a copy of his report, which was riddled with vague language and unsubstantiated claims, and left without another word. Melanie immediately emailed a copy to Carol, who responded with a single word. Laughable. But Melanie wasn't laughing. Later that afternoon, as she returned from picking up her kids from school, she found another surprise waiting for her. A chain-link fence had been erected around her pool, complete with a padlock and a large sign that read, "Safe area, do not enter." She stood there in stunned silence, her children looking on in confusion and fear. Lily clutched her hand and asked, "Mom, why are they doing this to us?" Melanie didn't have an answer. All she could do was hug her daughter tightly and promise her that everything would be okay. But deep down, Melanie knew this was a turning point. The HOA had crossed the line, and it was time to fight back. That evening, as the kids slept upstairs, Melanie sat at her kitchen table surrounded by documents, photos, and notes. She drafted a letter to the HOA demanding the immediate removal of the fence and detailing their ongoing harassment. She also contacted Frank, asking if his crew could come back to finish the cleanup once the fence was gone. But Melanie wasn't just planning to react, she was planning to go on the offensive. If Silas Whitaker thought he could intimidate her into submission, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Melanie's resolve hardened as the chain-link fence around her pool stood as a physical reminder of the lengths the HOA, and Silas Whitaker in particular, were willing to go to assert their dominance. The fence wasn't just a barrier, it was a provocation, a declaration of war on her home and her family. As she stared at the padlock glinting in the morning sunlight, she realized that playing defensively wasn't enough anymore. If she didn't take control of the situation, Silas would only escalate further. Her first call that morning was to her lawyer, Carol Hastings. Melanie outlined the latest development, her voice tight with frustration. Carol didn't mince words. "This fence is illegal. They have no authority to physically alter or block access to your property. This is textbook harassment, Melanie. We're going to use this. How do we get it taken down?" Melanie asked, pacing her kitchen. "I can't let my kids keep seeing this every day. It's making them scared in their own home." Carol paused. "We need to file an injunction to force its removal, but that'll take time. Meanwhile, I suggest you gather as much evidence as possible to show how absurd their claims are. If we can disprove their justification for the fence, it'll make our case even stronger." Melanie nodded, her mind already racing with plans. As she ended the call, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Frank, the pool contractor. He'd sent the final report on the condition of the pool after the cleanup. The findings were exactly what Melanie had expected. The pool was structurally sound, the equipment was in perfect working order, and the so-called safety hazards were non-existent. This report, combined with the HOA contractor's laughably vague inspection, gave her a solid foundation to challenge Silas's actions. But she wasn't stopping there. Over the next few days, Melanie shifted into full investigator mode. She began researching the history of the HOA and its leadership, starting with Silas himself. It didn't take long to uncover troubling patterns. Silas had been involved in multiple disputes with homeowners over the years, often targeting those who resisted his authority. In at least 2 documented cases, homeowners had been pressured into selling their properties after facing relentless fines and restrictions. Both properties were later sold to the same developer, Whitaker Holdings LLC. The name set off alarm bells in Melanie's mind. It couldn't be a coincidence. Digging further, she found that Whitaker Holdings had quietly acquired several parcels of land in the neighborhood over the past 5 years, all of them linked to disputes with the HOA. The developer seemed to specialize in flipping residential lots for commercial purposes, often turning them into multi-unit housing complexes or upscale rentals. Melanie couldn't prove it yet, but she was beginning to suspect that Silas was using the HOA as a weapon to clear out properties for his own financial gain. And now it seemed her home was next on his list. Armed with this information, Melanie reached out to a local private investigator, Dan Mitchell, to dig deeper into Whitaker Holdings and its connection to the HOA. Dan, a grizzled ex-cop with a reputation for thorough work, agreed to take the case. "I've seen these kinds of power plays before," he said during their first meeting. "HOAs can be ruthless when there's money on the line. I'll see what I can find." While Dan worked his angles, Melanie continued her own efforts to fight back. She contacted her neighbors, hoping to find allies among them. To her surprise, a few of them were more sympathetic than she'd expected. One older woman, Mrs. Harris, revealed that Silas had been pressuring her to replace her mailbox with one that met community standards, even though her current mailbox was perfectly functional. Another neighbor, a single father named Greg, admitted that Silas had fined him repeatedly for unauthorized landscaping after he planted a small vegetable garden in his backyard. "These fines aren't about rules," Greg said bitterly. "They're about control. Silas wants everyone to bend to his will." The second you push back, he makes your life hell. Melanie shared her suspicions about Whitaker Holdings, and the neighbors listened with growing unease. While they weren't ready to take public action yet, fear of retaliation loomed large. They agreed to quietly support Melanie's efforts. Mrs. Harris even provided her with copies of HOA newsletters and meeting minutes that hinted at Silas's close ties to the developer. One night, as Melanie was poring over the documents Mrs. Harris had given her, Dan Mitchell called with an update. "You were right about Whitaker Holdings," he said. "The company is registered under a shell corporation, but I traced it back to Silas's nephew. It's a family operation. They're using the HOA to create artificial pressure on homeowners, driving down property values so they can swoop in and buy cheap." Melanie's grip tightened on the phone. "So it's all a scheme. But how do we prove it?" "Let me dig a little deeper," Dan replied. "If there's money changing hands between the HOA and the developer, there'll be a paper trail. These guys always leave something behind." As Dan continued his investigation, Melanie focused on her next immediate goal, getting the fence removed. She filed her injunction, armed with Frank's contractor report and photographic evidence of the pool's clean condition. But she knew the legal process would take time, and Silas was likely planning his next move. Sure enough, just days after filing the injunction, Melanie found another HOA notice taped to her front door. This one accused her of violating noise ordinances during the pool cleanup and threatened additional fines if she continued to disturb the peace. It was the final straw. Melanie stormed into the HOA office, determined to confront Silas directly. The receptionist, Linda, looked up from her desk with a thin, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ms. King, how can I help you today?" "I need to speak with Silas," Melanie said, her voice cold. "Mr. Whitaker is in a meeting," Linda replied, her smile unwavering. "But I'd be happy to pass along a message." "I'm not leaving until I speak with him," Melanie shot back, crossing her arms and planting herself firmly in front of the desk. Linda hesitated, then sighed. "Wait here." A few minutes later, Silas emerged from the back office, his expression carefully neutral. "Ms. King," he said, his tone oozing false politeness. "What can I do for you?" Melanie didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You've crossed every line imaginable, Silas. The fence, the fake inspections, the vandalism. You think you can bully me into giving up my home? It's not going to work." Silas's smile tightened. "I'm not bullying anyone, Ms. King. I'm simply enforcing the rules. If you feel otherwise, you're welcome to take it up with the board." "I'm taking it up with the judge," Melanie retorted. "And while we're at it, I'd love to hear your explanation for Whitaker Holdings buying up every property you've driven into foreclosure." For the first time, Silas's composure slipped. His jaw tightened, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You will," Melanie said, turning on her heel and walking out of the office. As she left, she felt a surge of determination. The pieces were finally coming together, and she wasn't going to let Silas or anyone else intimidate her. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Melanie felt like she had the upper hand. Melanie returned home from her confrontation with Silas feeling a mixture of satisfaction and unease. She had managed to rattle him, but she knew that wouldn't be the end of it. Silas wasn't the type to back down easily, and she had no doubt that he'd already begun planning his next move. As much as she wanted to celebrate her small victory, she also knew she had to stay vigilant. Every time she thought she had seen the extent of his pettiness, he found a way to stoop even lower. The next escalation came sooner than she expected. Just 2 days later, Melanie woke up to a series of sharp knocks on her door. Bleary-eyed, she opened it to find a group of HOA board members standing on her porch, clipboards in hand and expressions of thinly veiled disdain on their faces. Silas wasn't with them, but his presence was felt in the way they carried themselves, confident, dismissive, and clearly prepared for confrontation. "Ms. King," one of them, a middle-aged woman named Barbara, began in a tone that was meant to sound professional but came off as smug. We're here to conduct a mandatory inspection of your property. It's been brought to our attention that there are additional violations that need to be addressed. Melanie crossed her arms, blocking the doorway. Violations? Like what? Barbara's lips curled into a tight smile. It's come to our attention that your backyard fencing does not meet community standards, and there are concerns about unapproved modifications to your landscaping. We need to verify that everything is in compliance. Community standards? Melanie repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. This fence was here when I bought the house, and I haven't touched the landscaping. Well, Barbara said, clearly unfazed. That's exactly what we're here to confirm. If everything checks out, there's nothing to worry about. Melanie knew better than to let them roam freely on her property. I don't consent to any inspections without prior written notice, she said firmly. If you have concerns, put them in writing and send them to my lawyer. The board members exchanged glances, their smug expressions faltering slightly. Barbara's smile stiffened. Refusing an inspection could result in additional fines, Ms. King. Then add it to the pile. Melanie shot back, slamming the door before they could respond. She stood there for a moment, her heart pounding as she listened to their murmurs on the other side. Eventually, she heard their footsteps retreating, and the tension in her chest eased slightly. But she knew this wasn't over. Later that day, Melanie received an email from Carol. The private investigator, Dan Mitchell, had uncovered a bombshell, detailed financial records showing that Whitaker Holdings had been purchasing properties at significantly reduced prices, with the majority of the sales occurring shortly after HOA enforcement actions. Even more damning, there were transactions linking the developer directly to Silas Whitaker. The evidence painted a clear picture. Silas was weaponizing the HOA to force homeowners into selling, all for his personal gain. Carol's email ended with a simple but urgent suggestion. We need to make this public. Melanie agreed. She reached out to Greg, the single father who had expressed support for her efforts, and asked if he would help rally the neighbors. Greg, though hesitant, agreed to host a small gathering at his house that weekend, inviting homeowners who had been targeted by Silas or the HOA. Melanie spent the next few days preparing, compiling all the evidence she had gathered, Dan's report, the photos of her vandalized pool, and the fake inspection notices. It was time to show the community what was really happening. The meeting took place on a Saturday evening. About a dozen neighbors showed up, some curious, others clearly nervous about being seen at a gathering that could be interpreted as a direct challenge to the HOA. Melanie began by sharing her own story, detailing the harassment she had endured and the lengths Silas had gone to in order to disrupt her life. Then she presented the evidence, laying out the connections between the HOA and Whitaker Holdings. As she spoke, she could see the expressions of her neighbors shift from skepticism to anger to determination. When she finished, Greg stood up. This has gone too far, he said, his voice steady but resolute. Silas has been using the HOA to line his own pockets, and we've all been paying the price. It's time we did something about it. The group began brainstorming ways to fight back. Some suggested petitioning for Silas's removal as HOA president, while others talked about filing a collective lawsuit. But Melanie knew that Silas wouldn't be toppled so easily. He was too entrenched, too confident in his ability to manipulate the system. They needed a plan that would hit him where it hurt, his reputation and his wallet. The next escalation came just days later. Melanie returned home from running errands to find a construction crew on her property dismantling parts of her backyard fence. Furious, she demanded to know what they were doing, but the workers simply pointed to an official-looking document taped to her front door. It was an order from the HOA authorizing the removal of non-compliant structures. The document cited vague violations and listed Silas Whitaker as the approving authority. Melanie immediately called Carol, who was equally outraged. This is trespassing and destruction of property, Carol said. We'll file a motion to stop this, but it's going to take time. For now, document everything. Melanie spent the rest of the day photographing the damage and filming the workers as they tore down her fence. The sight of her once private backyard now exposed to the street filled her with a mix of anger and despair. But as she reviewed the footage later that night, she noticed something unusual. One of the workers was wearing a jacket with a logo she didn't recognize. It wasn't from the construction company listed on the HOA's notice. She sent the image to Dan, hoping he could identify it. The following morning, Dan called with an update. The logo belongs to a subcontractor frequently used by Whitaker Holdings. This isn't just HOA enforcement, Dan said. This is a coordinated effort to make your property look undesirable. They're setting you up to sell. Melanie's frustration boiled over. She was done playing defense. If Silas wanted to push her to the brink, she was going to push back even harder. She contacted a local journalist who had covered HOA abuses in the past, providing them with all the evidence she had gathered. Within days, the story went live, exposing Silas's corrupt dealings and the connection between the HOA and Whitaker Holdings. The article sparked outrage among the community, and neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out began sharing their own experiences. But Melanie knew Silas wouldn't go down without a fight. As the backlash against him grew, so did the pressure on her. Anonymous threats appeared in her mailbox, warning her to back off. Late one night, her security cameras caught a figure in a hoodie lurking near her garage, but the person disappeared before the police arrived. It was clear that Silas and his allies were getting desperate. Still, Melanie refused to back down. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. With Carol and Dan by her side and the support of her neighbors growing stronger, she prepared for the final confrontation. Silas had underestimated her resolve, but he was about to learn just how determined she could be. The morning of the final confrontation dawned gray and cold, as if the weather itself mirrored the tension building in the neighborhood. Melanie stood by her kitchen window, staring out at the wreckage of her once beautiful backyard. The fence had been torn down, the pool surrounded by the ugly chain-link barrier that Silas's crew had erected, and patches of her lawn were churned up by heavy machinery. It no longer felt like her sanctuary, it felt like a battleground. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her from her thoughts. It was Carol. "Everything's set," the lawyer said without preamble. "We have the injunction to force the HOA to remove the fence, and I filed a civil suit for harassment and property damage. But Melanie, be prepared. Silas isn't going to take this lying down. I wouldn't expect him to," Melanie replied. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the phone. "What about the financial records, the ones tying him to Whitaker Holdings?" "They're admissible," Carol confirmed. "But I'm betting he'll try to spin them as legitimate business dealings. That's why it's critical we use the testimonies from your neighbors. If we can prove a pattern of harassment and intimidation, the judge will see through his lies." "Good," Melanie said. "Then let's make sure we hit him from every angle." As soon as she hung up, Melanie checked her security cameras. Over the past week, she had reinforced her system with additional cameras and motion detectors, ensuring there were no blind spots on her property. The footage had already caught several suspicious incidents, including a worker from Silas's crew attempting to tamper with her garage door late at night. That evidence, combined with Dan Mitchell's findings, painted a damning picture of Silas's tactics. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, Melanie heard the rumble of engines outside. Stepping onto her front porch, she saw a convoy of vehicles pulling up, 2 unmarked trucks carrying construction equipment, followed by Silas's sleek black SUV. He stepped out, flanked by 2 board members and a group of workers in safety vests. They moved with military precision, heading straight for the backyard as if they owned the place. Melanie was ready for them. She marched down the porch steps and intercepted Silas near the gate. "This ends now," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. Silas gave her a patronizing smile, the kind that had infuriated her since their first meeting. "Ms. King, I'm afraid you don't have a say in this matter. The HOA has determined that your property is in violation of community standards, and we're here to ensure compliance. Your violations are meaningless." Melanie shot back. "I have an injunction requiring you to cease all actions on my property. "You're trespassing." Silas's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "I don't think you understand how these things work. Injunctions take time to process, and until I see something legally binding, we're proceeding as planned." Melanie held up a folder containing a copy of the court order. "Then maybe you should read this." Silas glanced at the folder but didn't take it. "Nice try," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But this doesn't change the fact that your property poses a risk to the community." "Risk?" Melanie said, her voice rising. "The only risk here is the one you've created. You vandalized my pool, destroyed my fence, and sent your lackeys to intimidate me and my neighbors. I've documented every single violation, and I have enough evidence to bury you in court." For the first time, Silas's confidence wavered. His eyes darted to the workers behind him, who had paused their preparations, clearly uncertain about continuing under Melanie's glare. One of the board members leaned in to whisper something to him, and Silas's jaw tightened. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. Melanie turned to see 2 police cars pulling up in front of her house. A pair of officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they approached the group. "Is there a problem here?" one of them asked, his gaze sweeping over the construction equipment and the tense standoff between Melanie and Silas. "Yes," Melanie said firmly. "These people are trespassing on my property and violating a court order." The officer looked to Silas, who immediately tried to spin the situation. "We're acting in accordance with the HOA's bylaws. This property has been deemed non-compliant. The court order trumps your bylaws." The officer interrupted, holding up a hand. "If there's a legal dispute, it needs to be resolved in court, not here. For now, I'm going to have to ask you and your crew to leave." Silas's face turned red with barely contained anger. "This is outrageous. Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," the officer said coolly. "And I suggest you cooperate unless you want this to escalate further." For a moment, it seemed like Silas might argue, but then he turned on his heel and barked an order to the workers. "Pack it up. We're leaving." Melanie watched as the crew hastily loaded their equipment back into the trucks. Silas climbed into his SUV, slamming the door hard enough to make the vehicle rock. As the convoy pulled away, Melanie felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had won this battle, but she knew the war wasn't over yet. Later that afternoon, Carol called with more good news. The judge had expedited the hearing for Melanie's lawsuit, and the HOA would be required to appear in court the following week. "This is your chance to expose everything," Carol said. "With the evidence we've gathered, they won't stand a chance." Melanie spent the next few days preparing for the hearing, determined to see this through to the end. When the day finally arrived, she walked into the courtroom with her head held high, flanked by Carol and Dan. Silas and his legal team were already there, but for the first time, he looked less like a man in control and more like someone desperately trying to hold on to a crumbling facade. The team were already seated, their expressions grim as they watched her approach. The hearing was intense, with both sides presenting their cases. Carol laid out the evidence methodically, painting a clear picture of Silas's corruption and the HOA's pattern of harassment. The testimonies from Melanie's neighbors only strengthened her case, revealing the extent of Silas's intimidation tactics. In the end, the judge ruled in Melanie's favor, ordering the immediate removal of the fence, the cessation of all HOA actions against her property, and financial compensation for the damages she had endured. Silas, meanwhile, was referred to state authorities for further investigation into his dealings with Whitaker Holdings. As Melanie walked out of the courthouse, she felt an overwhelming sense of vindication. The fight had been long and grueling, but she had stood her ground and won. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to relax, knowing that her home was truly hers again. The weeks following the court's decision felt like a breath of fresh air for Melanie. For the first time since she'd moved into the neighborhood, her home was truly her own again. The chain-link fence was removed within days, leaving her backyard open and peaceful once more. The pool, once filled with mud and debris, was finally restored to its former pristine condition. Her children, Lily and Jack, wasted no time diving back into the water, their laughter echoing through the yard. Watching them play, Melanie felt a deep sense of relief, as though the weight of the entire ordeal had finally been lifted. The fallout for Silas Whitaker was swift and severe. The investigation into his dealings with Whitaker Holdings revealed an elaborate scheme to drive down property values through HOA enforcement, allowing him and his associates to purchase homes at a fraction of their worth. The court ordered Silas to step down as HOA president, and the local authorities launched a broader inquiry into his activities, including allegations of fraud and embezzlement. His once commanding presence in the neighborhood was now reduced to whispers of disgrace among the homeowners he had once controlled. With Silas gone, the HOA was left in disarray. The remaining board members scrambled to distance themselves from his actions, but the damage to their credibility was done. At the next community meeting, Melanie attended for the first time not as a target but as a voice for change. She spoke candidly about her experiences, calling for transparency, fairness, and accountability moving forward. To her surprise, she found herself nominated for a leadership position on the board. Though initially hesitant, she accepted, realizing that the best way to prevent another Silas was to take an active role in shaping the HOA's future. Her appointment was met with cautious optimism by her neighbors. Those who had once avoided her now approached her with words of support and gratitude. Mrs. Harris, the elderly woman who had shared the HOA's meeting minutes, thanked her with tears in her eyes, saying, "You stood up for all of us when we were too afraid. You made this a better place." Even Greg, the single father, pitched in to help Melanie repair her backyard, replacing the damaged sections of the fence and planting new shrubs around the perimeter. The sense of community that had been fractured under Silas's rule began to heal, and Melanie was heartened to see her neighbors coming together to rebuild what had been lost. But it wasn't just the physical repairs that mattered. For Melanie, the victory was about reclaiming her sense of security and autonomy. The fight had tested her limits, pushing her to confront not just external challenges but also her own doubts and fears. In the end, she had proven to herself and to her children that standing up for what was right was always worth it, no matter the odds. One evening, as the sun set behind the tall oak trees lining her yard, Melanie hosted a small gathering to celebrate the restoration of the pool. Her neighbors, once distant and wary, now mingled easily, laughing and sharing stories over plates of barbecue and glasses of lemonade. Lily and Jack splashed in the water with the other neighborhood kids, their joy infectious. As Melanie stood by the pool watching the scene unfold, Carol approached her with a knowing smile. "You did it," the lawyer said, raising her glass in a toast. "You turned this place around." Melanie smiled back, the weight of the past months finally replaced with a quiet pride. "We did it," she corrected. "This wasn't just about me. It was about all of us." The party carried on into the evening, the soft glow of string lights casting a warm ambience over the yard. As Melanie looked around at the people who had become her allies, her friends, she realized that the home she had fought so hard to protect was no longer just a house. It was a symbol of resilience, a place where her family and her community could truly thrive. For the first time since moving in, Melanie felt like she belonged. And as she watched her children laugh and play under the stars, she knew that her fight had been worth every moment. The house, and the life she had built within it, was finally and undeniably hers.